Alright, so today we're talking about some tips and tricks with guitar solos. If you're a beginner, intermediate player, I want to start off by saying I don't think that tips and tricks should be lumped together. A tip is way different than a trick. These are mostly tips. Tips are helpful. Tips are acts of generosity. And tricks are dirty tricks. So I think these are 4 tips and 1 trick. So technically they are tips and tricks, but they're mostly tips. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about different contexts of solo. Tip number 1 is context for a guitar solo, which means you need to know the chords, all right? So I'm gonna lay down 2 different chord progressions. I can do this with this looper pedal I'm gonna use. I'm gonna talk about that in a second. But here's what we got. We've got D to A7 to B minor to G. And then we also have B minor, A, G, F sharp, then back to D. And then we can switch the context. So I think tip number 1 is context. The other thing that's interesting is, you know, the thing I love about tips and hate about tricks is that, like, a lot of these are used in conjunction at the same time, so listing them is difficult. The first 2 tips we have are going to be talking about context, and then also talking about chord spelling and letting it ride, okay? So, really quick, this video is sponsored by Sweetwater and Pigtronix. The reason that I can loop 2 of these chord progressions together is because I'm using the Infinity 3 looper. The reason that's super important is because not all looper pedals can loop 2 separate chord progressions independent of each other, and this is actually kind of critical in what we're doing today because this first chord progression is a D to an A to a B minor to a G. And then the second chord progression does not have a D major in it, which is the context tip that we're talking about, all right? So, context is knowing the chords essentially behind what you're going to be playing a solo over. Now, it is not necessary to know that as long as you know the key that you're in, but you can say that the key that you're in is also kind of context, right? So, we're in the key of D, we're playing the 1 chord in the key of D, which is D major, we're playing the 5 chord, which is A, we're playing the 6 chord, which is B minor, any type of B minor. I like to rock that B minor 11 because I'm classy. And then the 4 chord, which is G major 7, all right? Again, I just did that by counting off the notes in D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D, right? So, we have a 1, 5, 6, 4 progression, which I think is like the most common chord progression ever made in, like, you know, popular Western music, all right? Now, the context of what we play over that might change depending on the tips that we're talking about, okay? So again, that Pigtronix Infinity 3 looper is great because you can just hit a button and then just switch back and forth between the context of those 2 loopers. So thank you, Sweetwater, for sending these over. There's another one that's going to be a trick later, so stay tuned for that. Now, what I mean by outlining and spelling the chords in the second tip is be like, all right, well, we have this D major chord to A, to B, to G. So spelling a chord out is basically just playing the notes that make up that chord, okay? So I know that a D major, the notes in there are a D, F sharp, and an A, right? So I can play a D, F sharp, and an A over that first chord. Alright, so that was just kind of something I made up with the notes that populate the home chord in that key. Even if the chord's behind, even if the context changes behind what I'm playing, I'm staying in the key, so it'll make sense. How I did that was I started with the root note, 5th fret on the A string. I slide to its major 3rd, that F sharp, which is the 9th fret on the A string. You can grab that 2nd note in that, so D, E, F sharp, all in that same string on the A string. Then I'm getting to the 7th fret on the D string, which is an A. So I'm getting D, F sharp, A, straight down. I'm arpeggiating that chord, okay? So I spelled this chord out. That's generally how we talk about spelling chords, is playing the notes that make it up. Arpeggios are the way to do it. Okay, so gotta learn just a couple arpeggio shapes that you can put over a root note. So anytime you see that D chord, again, even though the chords are changing behind it, those notes are all in the scale, they're all in the key, so it helps. Now the next thing we can do is change the spelling of that with the chord, right? We go from an A, or a D to an A. And again, remember, we started that second chord on the 5th fret of the E string. I can do that same shape. Okay, so I'm just really kind of moving these around. All right, now here's the thing though. It's like, I'm playing these solo notes in the same register, really the same kind of area on the guitar. They're the same notes I used to make that chord. So it doesn't really fit as well as maybe it could, when really we can very easily change the register of these shapes just by moving the arpeggio into a higher part of the neck. Right, I'm playing this D'Angelico Deluxe SS. So, you know, I could take this and like octave way up here, but that's kind of hard. That's way too far up the neck. So what I can do is I can octave, right? And I can start that arpeggio here. So it's really the exact same thing, except when I get to the B string, I compensate. So now I've got the 7th fret on the G string, to the 9th fret, to the 11th fret, and that lines my middle finger up with that 10th fret of the B string. And do the same thing with that A, but again, I'm going to move that a string lower. So instead of D, A, I've got D. The exact same notes, but the context, the register is different. So it kind of fits a little bit better. Another beautiful thing about this pedal is if you do end up kind of practicing in the register, you can actually turn the volume of the loops down independently, right? So remember, I have 2 loops. There's the D major one that starts out, and there's the other one. I hit that second one a little harder, so I have like an independent volume control of each one, which I can use after the fact, right? So eventually, no matter what register you end up playing on, you can actually really morph the volume of that after the fact, which is a very important looper pedal feature that I did not realize that I needed until I got a little bit better with the looper pedal and I kind of understood how they all work, right? So again, that's why this Pigtronix Infinity 3 is awesome. Definitely go to Sweetwater and pick one up. They also have other smaller loopers if you just want something a little smaller, but love the Pigtronix stuff. I think it sounds actually the best, all right? Now remember, that whole tip, that second tip, after knowing the context, is spelling the chord out and letting it ride. Okay, what do I mean by letting it ride? Minor pentatonic, that's how we ride. I'm spelling ride with the Y, as my band Emeryld Ryders does. So, like for example, what we could do is something like this. I'll spell the chords out. I'll start with the higher octave. That was kind of juicy, that was kind of saucy. Spelling the chords out first, letting it ride, getting into minor pentatonic, because all the tastiest notes are going to be in the relative minor pentatonic scale. Okay, so you already know what this means, I'm sure. In the key of D, there's one spot, it's relative minor, where you just rip. You just rip and you ride. Minor pentatonic, all right? The relative minor is always 3 frets, 3 notes behind where we start, okay? So if the 5th fret of the A string is my root note, the 2nd fret of the A string is where my relative minor is. That happens to be a B. I could also find that on the low E string by going to the 7th fret and then getting into that 7, 10, 7, 9, 7, 9, 7, 9, 7, 10, 7, 10. Okay? So a lot of people learn the pentatonic scale or scales in general independent of thinking of arpeggios, but again, the best tips are ones that work at the same time. So if you notice, when I get to that octave, well, where am I actually here? I end up on that note, the A on the B string, right, which is the 10th fret. Well, this was part of the these notes don't have to be independent of each other. I can start off by just ripping through those arpeggios, right? So see how I did that? I started with that arpeggio, but I'm really doing that inside that minor pentatonic shape that we all kind of get pretty decent at, okay? So start with intention, start thinking about the context of where you are, and then start adding some of those chord spellings and start ripping it, just ripping it and letting it ride, okay? So again, register and important are also just other tips that you could use. One thing that I want to kind of add to the register tip, not a trick, a tip, is to be wary of maybe just the highest note that you want to shoot for. If you start getting really familiar with arpeggios, they just kind of become these little isolated things where it's like, all right, D major. It's like, well, where do I want to go there? Well, let's think of, I'm in the key of D, what's the highest D note that I want to maybe just target? And let's say right here. This is a D on the B string, okay, the 15th fret. So I'm gonna be very wary of this note right here, and I'm gonna jump into it, all right? So maybe I can just start here. I don't wanna start. You could, but you've ruined the suspense. Build up into it. See how just kind of playing around beneath that chord in positions kind of has a vibe, and then when you slide up into it, it has a little bit of a different effect, right? So, you know, I can just be kind of just noodling, dare I say it, until I want to be like, all right, I'm getting a little bored here. And then just climb that pentatonic scale and hit that note up top, okay? So, knowing where you are, getting into a different register, and then targeting that specific note, we want to target that note, is something that you can do, right? Another way to think about this is being like, all right, well, maybe this is the highest note that I want to go to, but then there's also that minor pentatonic sweet spot. That note right there, it's always the G string wherever your pointer finger lines up. In this case, this is the D below that. That's going to be a target note for me. And this is where I want to bring in the other loop that we started with, okay? Now you remember that that first loop was D, A, B minor, G. That definitely has a certain vibe. Everything that I play is going to sound D major pentatonic-y, right? Notice I didn't play really anything differently over those progressions, but the context changed. I went to a progression that did not have the one chord, and instantly it felt like there was a little more feeling to it. And maybe, you know, the absence of the one chord affected how I was playing it, but I think what's more accurate is that removing the resolution that that one chord provides, go into a 6, 5, 4, 3 progression, just kind of changes the context of how those notes are going to sit, right? And again, that one chord is always, if you're really heavy on that one chord, it's going to sound kind of happier. Now this descending context, bed of sound, is just going to alter how you play, how you kind of perceive these notes to sound. Some people would call this playing modally. We definitely do not have to get into that. But I think the tip is to think of like where you're going and then what you want to target once you get there. Okay, so I want to target that root note. what I want to do is I want to create a context where I may be backing into it. So we're going to do this thing. This is one of the oldest solo tricks in the book is starting the note bent up and then bringing it down for a safe landing into the home note. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to play that first chord progression, which is a 1, 5, 6, 4. And when I go to the next progression, which starts on the 6th chord, I want to hit that D note, right? So maybe. And then the second time around, I'm going to wait until we get to the spot where we're going to change. See how it changed? There's that root note. We go back. And then when I get to that home chord, the context of just kind of like targeting the note hits different. You have to admit, it hits different. Just like ordering your gear from Sweetwater hits different when you get that candy. Even though I don't eat the candy, I'll be the first to admit, I still appreciate getting the candy. You know, and that just may say something about me as a consumer in general, but I just always appreciate getting the candy. I might eat the candy, I probably won't, but it's always just good to have. It just makes me feel like somebody's thinking about me, someone's taking care of me. So those are the main tips. We got a trick for you, all right? And the next trip is going to be the Echolution 3, which is another Pigtronix pedal. I love their pedals. It's a delay pedal. And the reason this is a trick is because we're going to add effects to what we're playing on a solo, all right? Now, using effects with a looper pedal is a question I get sometimes, and I personally think you should always add the effects before the looper, because then you can lay down the loop more or less pretty cleanly, and then put the effect on afterwards, okay? So we'll do the classier chord progression, the second one, with the delay. Okay? Still going, right? So that way the effect isn't getting into the loop, so I think it still sounds pretty good. The reason I love this pedal here is because the tap tempo is really easy to use. If you want an effects pedal to use with a looper, get it with the tap tempo button, because then you can really easily set the speed of the effect, if it is a time-based effect, to the speed of your loop. So what I mean by that is, let me play that first one again. 2, 3, whatever BPM I was feeling at that moment, I can tap into it just by pressing it. I'll put the mix up a little bit. Love it. Super cool, right? So, again, this pedal in itself, these pedals work really well together because they're both stereo, 2 in, 2 out, and you can really change how the type of delay and everything. So I almost think that that's a trick, because you're just taking your existing sound and then just kind of playing over it. And again, like I said, set that tap tempo so it kind of syncs up more or less to what you're doing, right? So yeah, those are some 4 tips and a trick. I feel like that was actually more than 4 tips. Well, you know, bonus tip. Whenever you're building a loop, do it with closed chord voicings, because if, you know, I could have done that D, A, B minor, G part, but here, let me just erase this loop, and I'll give you if these were open chords, like, doesn't sound as good, right? Because you're fighting the loop. You want to have a little bit of a closed volume loop. Even if I adjusted the volume with that adjustment after the fact, it still would have been kind of like a dirty loop. The way you get your loops tighter is by closing your chord voicings and then having your fretting hand really kind of control where those stop and start, and then you'll be able to like really like hit the tempo a lot cleaner. So that's just a bonus tip, not a trick. So now it's 5 tips and a trick. Do you think I can actually rename all the tips that I said? Do you think I just make this stuff up? I did a lot of study, a lot of prep work for this video. Tip number 1 was context. Tip number 2 was spell the chord out, then let it ride. Tip number 3 was register and location. Tip number 4 was targeting, knowing what you're gonna do. Trick number 5 was effect, and then the tip that I just shared about using closed. I did it! I wasn't sure I was gonna do that. I was really thinking maybe I would screw that up at the end. But thanks to the power vested in me by Sweetwater and Pigtronix and D'Angelico and the Super Blackmagic amp that I'm playing through, I was able to deliver once again. So definitely click that link if you want to help support the channel. Show Sweetwater some love. Anything you buy there, if you click that link, it'll definitely help me out getting it through there. Treat yourself. That's the greatest tip of all. Love yourself. Treat yourself to the gear that you so desperately want. Don't worry about it. You can get financing through them. Treat yourself, and in the meantime, have a great day.